Hello everyone, welcome to the class of Modern Indian History. In today's class, we are going to explore about two important policies associated with British territorial expansion in India, the Subsidiary Alliance as well as the Doctrine of Lapse. Before understanding these policies, let's understand why these policies matter. We know that the British in India established their power not by chance. The empire was carefully executed through well-designed policies. We know that the British came to India for trading purpose. However, after the Battle of Plassey and Buxar, they came to recognize that they need political power to defend their commercial as well as economic interest. From that moment onwards, each and every one of their policies are carefully designed through this way. Now, why these policies are matter, or what are the important aims of these policies? First thing is that they wanted to consolidate their political control through their well-designed policies. The British wanted to establish their power over Indian regional kingdoms, or they wanted to suppress the power of these regional kingdoms through well-designed policies such as Subsidiary Alliance, Doctrine of Lapse, annexations, direct military confrontations, etc. However, these direct military confrontations are pretty expensive. So they wanted to establish their control over the kingdoms through carefully planned and executed policies such as Doctrine of Lapse, Subsidiary Alliance, etc. The second reason is that they wanted to extract economic resource from India. So, we know that India represented vast resources, revenue, raw materials, as well as India was a greater market for this European product. So, each annexed territory, each conquered territory represent extra revenue for the English East India Company. So, in order to control India, politically suppress India, so thereby the company can extract much more resource. So, that is the second reason. Now, another most important thing is that legitimization of the colonial rule. So, legitimization of the colonial rule in the sense, on the one hand, the company is trying to expand their political power by suppressing Indian regional kingdoms. On the other hand, they are trying to legitimize this imperial expansion. They are creating a narrative of justification of this imperial expansion. We all heard about the civilizing mission of the English East India Company, that they are trying to claim themselves as modernizers. As a part of this modernization project, they introduced measures such as Western education, Western healthcare facilities. They also abolished some of the social evils of India like sati, etc. Thereby, they are creating narrative of modernization for this India, and as well as the English East India Company's rule is concerned. So, what we can say is that one hand they are expanding their territories, they are capturing, annexing more and more territories to the East India Company's regime, and on the other hand, they are legitimizing this colonial project of expansion. So, this thing we can see as a backdrop of the introduction of the policies such as Doctrine of Lapse, Subsidiary Alliance, etc. Now, let's talk about the policy Subsidiary Alliance. So, this is our first case study. Let's get into what is this Subsidiary Alliance means. So, first we need to understand the historical background in which Subsidiary Alliance has been introduced. So, for that we have to start with the decline of Mughal Empire. We know that after the death of Aurangzeb in the year 1707, Mughal Empire has been gradually declining. Now, in this context of political fragmentation, the power was actually shifted to the regional powers, the regional governors, etc. So, this political fragmentation was used by the European powers, particularly the English East India Company, to establish control over Indian kingdoms, Indian states, etc. Now, I also mentioned that when this political fragmentation took place, when the Mughal Empire gradually got declined, the Mughal Emperor became powerful only symbolically. The real power was shifted to these regional kingdoms, regional states. Like, we have number of powerful regional kingdoms during this period like Marathas, Mysore, Hyderabad, Rajput kingdoms, Sikh Empire, etc. So, there are multiple Indian regional kingdoms are there, and these regional kingdoms are individually very strong. However, they were fighting among themselves, they were competing each other for more power, authority, etc. So, the company wanted to establish their grip over these regional kingdoms through various policies such as Subsidiary Alliance. Now, And the third factor related to the British expansion is Anglo-French rivalry. Let's analyze how this factor, Anglo-French rivalry, paved a way for the British expansion in India. We know that the British as well as the French, they were global rivals. They were major rivals in Europe, and one of the most important theatre for this Anglo-French rivalry was India. After the Carnatic War, especially after the Third Carnatic War, English East India Company could finally defeat French East India Company, and thus actually provided greater confidence for the English East India Company to pursue their expansionist policies over India, because there is no major challenge just like the French East India Company. Now, another most important policy which affected the British expansion is fear of Napoleon's influence. So this might seem tricky how this Napoleon's influence or Napoleon Bonaparte's campaign, how it influenced the British expansion in India. The thing is that after Napoleon's victory of French Revolution and after his successful campaign of Egypt in the year 1798, the British feared that there is a possibility that Napoleon would enter into Indian subcontinent through Persia or Afghanistan, and what if he create a friendly alliance with any one of the hostile Indian kingdoms such as the Tipu Sultan of Mysore. We know that Tipu had strong kind of dislikes towards the English East India Company. What if there is a possible alliance between Napoleon Bonaparte as well as the Tipu Sultan of Mysore? So that kind of a thought in fact provoked the company. It created some kind of dangerous situation as far as company's expansion is concerned. So they wanted to, English East India Company wanted to suppress all the regional kingdoms, almost all the important regional kingdoms, through implementing policies such as Subsidiary Alliance. We know that once a state or a regional kingdom entered or agreed to sign in the Treaty of Subsidiary Alliance, they can't maintain relationship with any other Europeans except the English East India Company. So those kind of strategic alliances, strategic treaties were introduced by the company for their political expansion. So even though Napoleon never invaded India, the perceived threat of Napoleonic invasion created a backdrop or a background for the territorial expansion of English East India Company in India. Now, let's talk about Lord Wellesley and his vision. So, in order to understand this policy of subsidiary alliance, which was introduced by this person, Lord Wellesley, we need to understand his vision. Why he introduced this particular policy, subsidiary alliance. So, he became the Governor General of India in 1798 when English East India Company was facing lots of internal as well as external threats and invasion. So, he wanted to not merely what we can say expand the English East India Company's territory, but he wanted to establish the supremacy or the paramountcy of English East India Company over India. So, for that purpose, he tried to create a protective ring or a kind of buffer zone around company's territories. Let's say that company is annexing lots of territories in India, and what if the rival kingdoms are locating on the boundaries of these territories annexed by English East India Company? It will always create a kind of dangerous situation. So, the company wanted to avoid these kind of what we can say the states which will always fight against the East India Company. Instead, they wanted to create friendly states or their allied states around their captured territories. So this is like this. If the company is capturing a particular territory like this, they wanted to make the friendship with all the territories or the regional kingdom which is surrounding this particular territory. They are creating a buffer zone, a kind of protective ring around their annexed territory. So this is the annexed territory of the East India Company. Now the company is making friendship with all the kingdoms which is surrounded by their territory, so they can avoid a possible invasion or a possible threat from these hostile Indian kingdoms. Now, so you can imagine the situation like this. You are building a kind of forts, a very majestic, mighty forts. And what if your enemies are surrounding at the doorstep of this fortress? So you have to avoid that threat. You have to eliminate the danger. For that, what you can do, you can make them the state as friends, as allies of your fortress. So thereby can avoid this danger, avoid this threat, and make a peaceful kind of friendly alliance with all these Indian states. That's what Lord Wellesley wanted to do through policies such as Subsidiary Alliance. Now, he also wanted to prevent alliances among Indian states. We already mentioned that the Mughal Empire was declining. At the same time, there are a number of regional powers are emerging like the Marathas, Mysore, the Rajput kingdom, Sikh kingdom, etc. These are really powerful kingdom. So the company feared that what if these states came together, they united together and formed an alliance against English East India Company. Definitely, this unified alliance can defeat English East India Company. In order to avoid those kind of possible unification or alliance among Indian states, he introduced this policy called Subsidiary Alliance, by which if a state agreed to sign this subsidiary alliance, they could not make any strategic decision regarding their foreign policy, their what we can say defense, etc. So it's a very strategic policy in that sense. I'll explain the major aspects of this policy. So here, let's discuss the main features of the subsidiary alliance. So this is a policy introduced by Lord Wellesley in the year 1798. Based on this policy, if an Indian ruler accepted this British policy of subsidiary alliance, what they have to do is that they have to maintain the British army in their territory. This is a scenario like this. Suppose there is a third party is invading an Indian regional kingdom. If they signed in this treaty of subsidiary alliance, the company army will give protection for this particular state. So it is a kind of protectionist policy as far as the regional kingdom is concerned. However, it also had number of challenges or limitation. I'll explain that. So the first point that we have to understand is that based on the Treaty of Subsidiary Alliance, the English East India Company will give their army to this particular regional kingdom who agreed to sign in the Treaty of Subsidiary Alliance. So they will get protection. If a third power attacks them, they will give protection. English East India Company will offer protection. They are offering their army. And the regional kingdom is maintaining this army, English East India Company's army. But the problem is that in order to maintain a huge or large European army, they have to pay lots of amount of money also. So the money has to be given by the regional kingdom as far as the maintenance of this European army is concerned. Suppose let's say that Mysore signed this Treaty of Subsidiary Alliance. So in the context of Mysore, the English East India Company will provide the army. Instead of maintaining this army, Mysore will provide the money for maintaining this army. So the company is offering protection. In order to maintain this army, the state, that particular state is providing the money. So it is actually a kind of protection which is given by the company. But the very strategic clause of this treaty is like this, or this policy is like this: no foreign relations without approval. Let's say the case of Mysore. If Mysore agreed to sign in the Treaty of Subsidiary Alliance or in this policy of Subsidiary Alliance, the company will give them army and the state will maintain this army by using their own expenses, their own money. And most importantly, the company, or not the company, the state, this particular state, in this case Mysore, they don't have any rights to design their foreign relationship. So, which means this particular state is actually, they are surrounding by the English East India Company's army. At the same time, they are surrendering their own sovereignty, their own internal rights and paramountcy to decide their foreign affairs, defense, etc. Now, the company will appoint a British resident at the court of this Indian regional kingdom. Moreover, this particular state who's agreed to sign this Treaty of Subsidiary Alliance, they can't make any appointment of any other Europeans in their territory without the permission of English East India Company. So, this is a very strategic policy which is decided to establish grip of company over the Indian kingdoms. So, it's a very simple policy. Simple policy in the sense that the company is offering army, and if the state is accepting this army, they have to provide the maintenance charge for this British army. But the strategic part or the tricky part of this treaty is that if the particular state agreed to sign this subsidiary alliance, they don't have any right, they don't have any voice over their foreign relationship. They can't make any Europeans, they can't appoint any Europeans in their territory unless the English East India Company gives permission. They don't have any voice of their diplomatic affairs, their defense, their foreign relationship, etc. The company will appoint a resident in their territory, and every matters related to administration will go through this channel of the English resident. So these are some of the important clauses or aspects of this treaty of subsidiary alliance. So with this treaty, they transformed themselves from a trading corporation to a paramount political power in India. So this flowchart will easily make you understand how this policy of subsidiary alliance worked. Indian state signing in this treaty of subsidiary alliance, they are accepting the British troops in their territory. Instead of this territory, they are providing the maintenance amount of money or subsidiary to the company for maintaining this army. What will happen? They will lose their foreign policy independence, they will lose their sovereignty, they will lose their voice and rights over their diplomatic affairs, their defense as well as their foreign relationship. Thereby, the company is establishing political control over the subsidiary of the state who signed in this treaty. Now, these are some of the important states which signed in this treaty of subsidiary alliance. The first state was Hyderabad, which signed in the year 1798. Mysore signed in the year 1799. When we discussed about the Anglo-Mysore Wars, we understood that after the fourth Anglo-Mysore War, Tipu Sultan got killed and the English East India Company reinstated Vodaya dynasty into power as far as Mysore is concerned, and Mysore was also forced to sign this treaty of subsidiary alliance. So Mysore became a part of this treaty in the year 1799 after the fourth Anglo-Mysore War. Now, Tanjore became part of this treaty of this policy in the year 1799. Awadh became a part in the year 1801, and there is this Peshwa Bajirao II who signed to agree in this treaty of subsidiary alliance in the year 1802. So if you are looking at this map, you can see the major states who agreed to sign this treaty of subsidiary alliance, including Awadh, Sindhya, Peshwas, Hyderabad, Mysore, Tanjore, etc. Now, let's talk about the Treaty of Bassein, which took place in the year 1802. So, this is the treaty which was signed between Bajirao II as well as the English East India Company. We already discussed this treaty in our when we take a class on this Anglo-Maratha War. We saw that after the battle of this Pune, which took place in the year 1802 between Peshwa Bajirao II and Yashwantrao Holkar, the Peshwa Bajirao II got defeated. So what he did, he approached or he sought help from the English East India Company. Now, English East India Company promised that they will offer the help, all the assistance to the Peshwa Bajirao II, but there is one condition: he had to sign in the policy or treaty of subsidiary alliance. So, this treaty of Bassein took place in the year 1802. As per this treaty, Peshwa Bajirao II agreed to sign in this policy of subsidiary alliance. Thereby, Maratha Confederacy became a part of the subsidiary alliance. So, thereby, the Marathas had to maintain British troops in their territory. Marathas had to pay or maintain money for this British troops. They don't have any independent voice of their diplomacy. However, British protection was guaranteed in exchange of the sovereignty of the Marathas. And we saw that what is the consequence of this Treaty of Bassein. The Maratha chiefs, especially Sindhyas as well as Holkars, they were triggered by the loss of sovereignty of Maratha Confederacy, and they declared Second Anglo-Mysore War against the English East India Company. So that we already discussed when we took a class on this Anglo-Maratha Wars. What are the advantages of this policy of subsidiary alliance as far as the East India Company is concerned? They can establish political dominance without waging pretty expensive wars in the context of India. That is the most important significance. Do you think that this is a direct annexation of these states? No, this is not direct annexation, right? These are indirect annexations only, because the ruler is remaining on the throne as far as the Indian kingdom is concerned. Even though the ruler is remaining on the throne, their most important affairs like foreign relationship, diplomacy, defense, etc. are controlling by the English East India Company. So it is an indirect format of control as far as Indian states are concerned. Now, so the company had military advantage because they can maintain their troops easily without paying any maintenance fee, because already the Indian kingdoms or Indian kings are paying this maintenance fee, and also got economic benefit through subsidies, the kind of amount paid by these kingdoms. Now, what are the impact of this subsidiary alliance on Indian state? The first one is loss of sovereignty. We explained this several times that once the Indian regional kingdom signed in this Treaty of Subsidiary Alliance, they will become a puppet king, because the most important aspect of a state's administration, diplomatic affairs, foreign affairs, it is controlled by the English East India Company. They can't make any kind of alliance with any other Indian rulers, any European powers, until and unless the English East India Company gives them permission to do so. Moreover, there will be an English resident in their court. Everything will be controlled by this English resident. So they are losing their sovereignty, and they have economic burden, because they are giving this huge amount of money to maintain the British troops in their territory, and which also will result the weakening of their own native armies. So these are some of the important what we can say impacts as far as these regional kingdoms are concerned. So this is a very important, crucial, strategic policy designed and defined by Lord Wellesley to establish indirect control and grip over the regional kingdoms. Thereby, he is converting these regional kingdoms as the allies or friends of English East India Company, and company could expand their political control over India in that sense. So that is about the subsidiary alliance. Now let's talk about another controversial policies of British expansion, the Doctrine of Lapse. So this policy is one of the most important reasons for Indian dissentment against English East India Company, and this policy also paved way for the revolt of 1857. So this is a policy introduced by Lord Dalhousie. So we mentioned that Subsidiary Alliance is introduced by Lord Wellesley, and Doctrine of Lapse is introduced by Lord Dalhousie, who served as the Governor General of India between 1848 to 1856. Now, based on this policy, the British would annex the princely states whose ruler died without having a natural heir or a biological successor. We know that adoption was considered as a perfectly valid thing as far as Indian customs and Indian traditions are concerned. If a king adopted son, if he don't have any natural heir or a biological heir, this adopted son will have equal legal rights as well as religious rights over this particular kingdom. He'll inherit the property, he can perform the funeral rites, etc. Which means he has equal legal as well as the religious rights, just like the biological son. However, this particular custom was completely negated or neglected by the English East India Company by declaring that we will annex the territory in which the present king or the current king is dying without having a natural heir or a biological heir. So this kind of adoption, which is part of Indian customs, Indian tradition, was completely neglected by the English East India Company, and they declared that the paramount power, the British power, could approve succession and they can reject the adopted heirs. So that is actually the crux of Doctrine of Lapse, where the company is annexing the territories whose ruler died without having a biological successor. Adopted son should not be recognized or acknowledged by the East India Company. So that is the crux of this particular policy. Now we need to understand the historical background in which this policy was introduced by Lord Dalhousie. So we have seen that by 1798 itself, Lord Wellesley introduced the policy of Subsidiary Alliance, and many Indian states including the Hyderabad, Marathas, Mysore, etc. became part of this Subsidiary Alliance. And by 1850, the second half of 19th century, company annexed almost all the important states of India. They established their grip over Indian regional kingdoms. Now also they wanted to continue this policy of expansion. So they asked this question, how can we continue expanding over India without waging any costly or expensive wars? So the answer was Doctrine of Lapse. Its main objective was territorial consolidation because, as I have mentioned earlier, each annexed state represents extra revenue, extra money for the company. Now let's talk about Lord Dalhousie, who introduced this policy. So he was the Governor General of India between 1848 to 1856, and he is a Governor General who stood for the centralization of Indian administration. Indian administration in the sense the centralization of East India Company's rule over India, because he believed that introducing a strong centralized empire will increase the efficiency of the rule of company over India. And it was during his time number of administrative reforms were introduced, like the expansion of transportation network, communication network, introduction of first electric telegraph, and it was during his time that public works department got developed. So he is a Governor General who is much more concerned about the efficiency of administration in India. Now, why he introduced the Subsidiary Alliance? The most important motive was territorial expansion, which will directly link to the revenue maximization. Now, let's talk about the features of Doctrine of Lapse. So, as I have mentioned, if the ruler dies without having a biological successor or a natural successor, thus even if the adopted son exists, company won't recognize that adopted son and the company will reject this adoption and they will annex the territory. That is the core or crux of this particular policy called Doctrine of Lapse. Now, let's talk about the major states annexed under this policy of Doctrine of Lapse. So, the first major victim of this policy is Satara. Satara was annexed by Dalhousie in the year 1848. Now, what happened in the context of Satara is that the ruler of Satara was Appa Sahib. He died without having a natural heir or a biological successor. Even though before his death he adopted one son, English East India Company was not ready to recognize this son, and they adopted the rejection and annexed Satara by invoking this policy of Doctrine of Lapse. Now, other states which was annexed under this particular policy is Jaipur and Sambalpur. Both of these states were annexed in the year 1849. Now, the annexation of Jaipur as well as Sambalpur made it clear that the policy of Doctrine of Lapse is not an isolated policy. The British will systematically implement this policy wherever the king dies without having a biological successor. Other most important states annexed under this policy were Bhagat and Udaipur. Bhagat was annexed in the year 1850 and Udaipur in the year 1852. Even though these are not politically as important, just like the Satara we mentioned earlier, or Jhansi which is annexed in the year 1853, even though these states are not that powerful or politically important, this policy, the annexation of these states made it clear that this policy is not going to be an isolated policy. The British will systematically implement the policy wherever it is possible. Now, let's talk about Jhansi, which was annexed in the year 1853 as far as this Doctrine of Lapse is concerned. Now, unlike all the other major states annexed under Doctrine of Lapse, it was the annexation of Jhansi which invoked fierce resistance among Indians. And this annexation of Jhansi under Doctrine of Lapse also created one of the greatest heroes of Indian history, Rani Lakshmi Bai. And it also became a reason for the 1857 revolt. What exactly happened in the context of Jhansi is that Jhansi was ruled by Raja Gangadhar Rao. He was a very loyal ruler and he maintained cordial relationship with the English East India Company. However, he died without having a biological successor. Even before his death, he adopted a son called Damodar Rao. After his death, Rani Lakshmi Bai requested English East India Company to consider the adopted son Damodar Rao as the legal successor of their kingdom, Jhansi. However, the company was not ready to hear this request, not ready to consider the request, and they invoked the doctrine of lapse and try to annex the state called Jhansi. So here, when the adoption of Damodar Rao was not considered and when the succession was rejected, it provoked Rani Lakshmi Bai. She actively participated in the 1857 revolt and she considered it as the biggest opportunity to challenge East India Company's rule in India. During the revolt of 1857, she tried to defend Jhansi and she later joined army with Tandia Topi. However, she finally killed at Gwalior during the part of the 1857 revolt. So, this policy, Doctrine of Lapse, indirectly contributed to the 1857 revolt. Now, another most important state which was annexed under this policy is Nagpur, which got annexed in the year 1854. So, if you are looking at the location of this particular state, Nagpur, you can see that it is located in the central part of India. So, which means it's very strategically important. So, if the company could annex this particular territory, they can bridge between North India as well as South India. They can also bridge between Western India as well as the Eastern India. So, that is a very strategical location. Moreover, Nagpur is also very important for rich quality of cotton. It is also famous for lots of minerals including iron ore, coal, etc. So, in every sense, Nagpur is a very important state and this was annexed by Dalhousie by invoking Doctrine of Lapse. In the context of Nagpur, the ruler died without having a biological heir. Even after his death, he adopted a son, but the adoption was not considered just like in any other case of this Doctrine of Lapse. And finally, it was annexed in the year 1854. Now, you can see here the chronological order of the states annexed under Doctrine of Lapse by Dalhousie. The first one is Satara, 1848, Jaipur, 1849, Sambalpur, again 1849, Bhagat, 1850, Udaipur, 1852, Jhansi, 1853, and Nagpur in the year 1854. So, this is the chronological order of the states annexed under the policy of Doctrine of Lapse by Dalhousie. So, here in this map, you can see the major states annexed under this particular policy. Nagpur is there, Satara is there, Awadh, Jhansi, Sambalpur. What is the advantage for the British as far as this policy is concerned? They can establish political, administrative as well as economic gains over these Indian states. As well as Indian states are concerned, they lose their sovereignty, they lose, it is actually an interference from the side of East India Company over the Indian states, customs, traditions, etc. And the company proved that they are ready to discard Indian customs and tradition if it serves the company interest or imperial interest. So it was an interference in their internal affairs. It is also part of their revenue extraction, and ultimately these states lose their sovereignty. So now let's talk about Doctrine of Lapse and relationship with the revolt of 1857, which we already discussed in the context of Rani Lakshmi Bai of Jhansi. We mentioned that a king died without having a natural heir. Even though he adopted Damodar Rao, the British didn't accept or acknowledge this adopted heir, and they invoked Doctrine of Lapse, which provocated Rani Lakshmi Bai to participate in the 1857 revolt. Now let's talk about the context of Nana Sahib. We know that the real name of Nana Sahib was Dondo Pant and he was the adopted son of Peshwa Bajirao II. Peshwa Bajirao II was the last Peshwa of the Maratha Confederacy. After the Third Anglo-Mysore War, he was pensioned off by the English East India Company. He was sent to a place called Bithur near Kanpur and he was given an annual pension of 8 lakh rupees. Nana Sahib was the adopted son of Peshwa Bajirao II and he expected that he will inherit the positions of Peshwa Bajirao II and he will also get the pension which was given by the company to the Peshwa Bajirao II. However, the East India Company humiliated Nana Sahib, mentioning that he is the adopted son and he is not eligible for this pension and other privileges. So here, even though directly this policy of Doctrine of Lapse is not applied, here also we can see that the company was not ready to recognize adoption. So, adopted heirs. That is why Nana Sahib also became part of this revolt of 1857 and he became an important leader of the revolt in Kanpur. Now, let's make a comparison between Doctrine of Lapse and Subsidiary Alliance. So, it's a comparison between direct annexation and indirect annexation. I know that you got an idea regarding these two policies, and we can see that this policy of subsidiary alliance is a policy of indirect annexation, right? Because we already mentioned that there will be a ruler on the throne, ruler will be remaining on the throne. However, their important aspects such as foreign policy, diplomatic aspects, defense, etc. were controlled by the English East India Company, and they will also appoint a British resident at the court of this particular kingdom. So, which means that the ruler is there, he will be remaining on the throne itself, but the real power will be vested in the hands of the English East India Company. So, it's a kind of indirect annexation. Now, coming to the context of Doctrine of Lapse, it's a direct annexation, right? If the ruler died without having a biological successor, the company will directly annex the territory, it will lapse into company's territories. So, it's a comparison between the direct annexation versus indirect annexation. We should have that conceptual clarity as far as these policies are concerned. Now, let's have a discussion on the major questions which were repeated as far as civil service is concerned. So, the first question, which of the following state not annexed the Doctrine of Lapse? Options: Satara, Jhansi, Nagpur, Awadh. We know that the answer is Awadh. Awadh was annexed under misgovernance, not under what we can say this Doctrine of Lapse. Now, we have the second question. Which one of the following statements does not apply to the system of subsidiary alliance introduced by Lord Wellesley? So, here are four options. The first option is to maintain large standing army at others' expense. We know that that is a part of subsidiary alliance, because the crux of subsidiary alliance is that the Indian kingdom is accepting protection, the British army. Now, second thing, to keep India safe from Napoleonic danger. When we discuss the background or backdrop of this subsidiary alliance, we mentioned that company is anticipating Napoleonic danger over India, Napoleonic invasion over India. So, in order to prevent a situation where Napoleon is uniting with any of the hostile rulers of India, they want to establish control over Indian states. So, that is why they introduced this policy. So, that is also true. Now, to secure a fixed income for the company. Do you think this is part of subsidiary alliance? They don't had any intention to secure a fixed amount of income. The rulers are actually paying some kind of amount for maintaining the army, but the company don't have a aim to have a secure fixed kind of income from these Indian states. So that is actually the right answer. If you are analyzing the fourth aspect, to establish British paramountcy over Indian state, that is right. So, the third option is not right, and that is actually the right answer. Now comes the third question, which is from UPSC Mains 2003. So, it's a question like this. Discuss the role of Lord Wellesley in the establishment of British paramountcy in India. I hope that you will be able to answer this question, because we made a comprehensive analysis of subsidiary alliance introduced by Lord Wellesley. So, you can include points such as he introduced this policy subsidiary alliance. He is the one who took an active role in defeating Mysore after the 4th Anglo-Mysore War. He forced Peshwa Bajirao II to sign this Treaty of Bassein. Thereby, Maratha Confederacy also became part of the subsidiary alliance. So, he played a key role in eliminating the threat of Marathas, and he is the one who took leadership to integrate Hyderabad as a part of this Treaty of Subsidiary Alliance. And also in the context of Awadh, also he introduced this policy of Subsidiary Alliance. So these are some of the policy that you can introduce, discuss while elaborating your answer. So these are some of the previous year questions as far as these two policies, Doctrine of Lapse and Subsidiary Alliance, are concerned. I hope you understood, and thank you so much.